Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are talking national political news of the day, and we only do three topics a show, and we really had to make some choices here because there is a lot of news, but we're going to start with the big one. The long-awaited first indictment of Donald Trump. Probably not going to be the last one, but the first one. Maybe, according to some people, the most underwhelming. He is charged with 34 counts. That's a lot of felony counts of falsification of business records, basically stemming from the payoff that Cohen, his attorney, had made to former porn star Stormy Daniels to keep her quiet during the 2016 campaign, about $136,000, I think it was, and it was basically represented as legal expenses, but when it was really there about 400,000 were paid, but that portion of was a to pay Cohen back for having fronted the 136,000. There is, but it had been paid off in increments over the year, and the accusation by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is that he did this in order to hide a campaign contribution, which not only went unreported, but exceeded the maximum campaign contributions in New York state law. Basically, it's a little bit complicated, but they couldn't just charge him with falsifying documents because the statute had run on that. So they could do it as falsification of documents at the felony level with an underlying crime. The underlying crime being the campaign finance non-disclosures or exceeding the limits. So there's a lot of question as to whether or not they can get him with all these things, because there's questions about the statute of limitations, it's tolling, because Trump was out of state, a lot of things going on. It also was president. A lot to talk about the legal aspects of it. Trump showed up to a circus, a media circus. There were tents all over the place. There were protesters on both sides. They actually almost got into it at one point. Police had to separate them. Marjorie Taylor Greene showed up. She got pretty much chased out of there. She was actually visibly shaken up. And so he went in, basically pled not guilty to the 34 charges. It's been set for a further hearing in December, which is like going right up against the primary season. As we've reported, nearly all of the Republicans are rallying behind him, including his opponents in the primary. DeSantis, who had initially criticized him, just fell into line. Some people are notably silent, such as Mitch McConnell's not saying anything. And most of the Democrats are staying pretty quiet about it. President Biden refuses to comment on it. And we can get into the politics of this. Will this benefit Trump? Will it hurt him in the short run versus the long run, depending on the goals? At any rate, it is not the real serious charges that they're expecting in Georgia, or perhaps pertaining to the Mar-a-Lago documents. But Dave, I'm going to hand it over to you. There's a lot more to say about these things, but I'm going to let you jump in here.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for the setup, as always. Like you said, this was a 34-page indictment of former President Trump. And if you watch the coverage at all, or if there's 16 pages of the indictment and then another 12 pages of facts that they wanted to just lay out there. But depending on the coverage that you watched, your source, it was either like, oh, thankfully there's finally a charge that is going to be brought against this person who has a long track record of committing crimes. That was the flavor of, obviously, from liberal sort of tainted or biased or leaning media, versus conservative media, which says that this is that it was pure partisanship and a political act, not a legal act. But somewhere in the middle is actually what's true, right? So anytime that you are charging a political figure with a crime, you have to take into account and weigh the consequences and the implications and the impact on the community. So in this instance, I think that it partially explains why the charges were not brought sooner, even though they were considered by the Manhattan DA's office.
Yes.
And also there were no federal charges yet to date by the Southern District of New York. So I will call those political calculations that have led us up to ultimately to yesterday. And so the question is, was it within the bounds of legal reasoning, or was it a little bit more overtly a political act? And we'll talk about that, but I think generally that's the dialogue, that's the framing of the issue. In terms of the event itself yesterday, you said you wanted us to cover the indictment circus, and it was in fact a circus. So for the couple weeks leading up to it, obviously people were hyping it up, whether it was Trump himself or media. But it turns out it was relatively uneventful, despite the fact that they covered it from a helicopter, like it was the OJ chase scene. So you could, there were, I don't know how many dozens of people scattered along the road from Mar-a-Lago to all the way to the airport down in Florida, and where he lives in Palm Beach. And then same thing when he arrived on the tarmac in LaGuardia, there were, some people, this state, Secret Service caravan of bodyguards that he had was at least a half a dozen vehicles, along with a few police officers and an ambulance. And I guess that's all protocol for if anything ever happens to the former president. But it was uneventful, given that there was so much hype. It was really uneventful.
He said nothing while he was in New York. He went back to Mar-a-Lago and gave a speech.
And there were hundreds of people there, not very many more than that. They closed off just a block, despite some of the hype surrounding it. They closed roads, et cetera, to make it relatively smooth. But like I said, it was uneventful. Marjorie Taylor Greene, it looked like she got out of the car for 10 minutes and got shouted back into the car and really didn't have any purpose for being there, like you said. But then all we found out afterwards when it went public was, like you said, the trial's not till December. So because it's a criminal charge and not a civil charge, where Trump's he's got a lot of activity in the civil courtrooms, and so he and his people are used to just having a lot of the capacity to spend a lot of money and dictate the schedule. But this is not like that. It seems like he's actually going to be held to account. They gave him plenty of time for his case. It's like all the way to December, like you said.
Right.
And so, but the speech, right? The speech that he gave at his house was at Mar-a-Lago once he got back to Florida. I saw Matt Gaetz there, and I saw Marjorie Taylor Greene there, and there were a few other people. He's got this like core group of constituents, we'll call them, the people that are vested in his success, but not a lot of, it was just like a party basically. And he gave that same kind of speech where he just aired his grievances and lashed out at the judge. And apparently, just one really last comment on just the overall circumstance of the circus. I believe it was Don Jr. that tweeted out pictures of the judge's children.
Yes.
And so that kind of the judge, I thought this was worth mentioning, that the judge actually spoke to, according to accounts in the courtroom, the judge spoke to Trump's legal team and to him personally in the courtroom and said, you have a track record of inflammatory language, and we don't want that. Like, we don't want you to incite violence in this case. And so it turns out that his son and whoever else was involved in, spreading that message out there. Really, it's not quite doxing somebody when you just send their picture out there and call them enemies, basically, but that's already started.
It's a danger to them. I mean, especially to the daughter. It's one thing for the judge, but to put the daughter out there, I mean, he should know better than that. There was no reason to do that. But then again, Don Jr. in my opinion, has no sense of decency. So that's just the way it is. Talking a little bit about the law of it. There's a lot of questions about this. He didn't provide any more details than we knew. Everybody was kind of expecting, well, he's going to to bring out as evidence, even tell us what the underlying crime was. He's, but basically Bragg said, well, I don't need to do that. I think he wants to hedge his bets, either go the federal or the state law as to what he does. But where I think that the defense might be able to raise a reasonable doubt is to say, oh, the hush money wasn't to benefit him, to hide the adultery from the voters, but to hide it from his wife. Could make, try to make that case, and therefore that's not a crime if that was the purpose, if it wasn't to benefit the campaign. A little iffy. It's not, that would be a little bit harder for them to make the case, but it's just to raise a reasonable doubt as to his intent. That standard is very powerful, and that's got a lot of people concerned. There's some other aspects of the case too. I discussed the statute of limitations or earlier, but Trump is claiming this has never been charged before. That's not exactly true. Falsification of business records is there. He was let out on his own recognizance, which is typical of white collar crime. He didn't have to make bail, and adding to the circus, we haven't seen any official mugshot so far, but we've seen several fake ones that the Trump people have put out in our fundraising on. It's bizarre, but the defense actually has 45 days to file some motions. They probably will make some motions to dismiss. I don't know New York law or the specifics of that law to really predict that, but I do think that they could possibly raise a reasonable doubt as to the intent, as to the underlying crime. And again, it's not a crime to hide an affair from your wife.
Yeah, so you pointed out a couple things. I'm glad we kind of are slowly unpackaging this, which is because there was so much hype in the last 48 hours about this. And it really is a relatively low key kind of conversation we can have about it. I think one of the things you pointed out was that even in the 12-page statement of facts, it wasn't clear what the sort of smoking gun connection is here that between those misdemeanors that are falsification misdemeanors, and then which crimes they were in the furtherance of. And I think there was reference to both campaign finance violations and taxation violations, and also there's reference to state and federal crimes. So like you said, it really is about leaving the options open to just kind of throw it all against the wall for the grand jury and say, see, there's enough stuff for a connection here. And it worked because there is. But then the question is, how will that play out in the courtroom? And that's, we'll find out. There's a lot still to happen. But there's a thing called, I think, the Bill of Particulars, where the defense can say, okay, look, you're making a legal claim here. What's your legal claim? We have a year to defend against something. You have to tell us what it is we're defending against. And so I think there's a little bit of chess involved in that piece of it, keeping that a little bit under, inside the vest, I guess is the metaphor there.
Yeah, it'll go a few weeks before it's held off, before it's, before they have to explain exactly the factual basis for their charges. There may have been some strategic reason not to bring it out on the day of the arraignment. And there's numerous reasons why. It's not the first time prosecutors have done this. They like to play games. They like to delay as long as possible to keep the defense from being able to have enough time to present its defense, to cut into that time. That is pretty typical strategy. I think it's kind of iffy ethically myself, but it's done all the time, even right here in Humboldt County. So it's just the way it is. But we'll talk a little bit before we run out of time about the politics of it.
Yeah.
It basically ended the primary. Is Trump going to be the candidate?
Yeah. So two things come to mind here, and I'm glad you circled back to that right away, because you had said in your last segment here, does it hurt him or help him? And one of the things is, well, they're certainly already selling merch with a mugshot. to hype up the fundraising. And you know, anytime you watch, I talked about this recently with somebody, I think it was you. This guy's got tax lawyers and bankruptcy lawyers and corporate lawyers and criminal lawyers and PR lawyers. He's got his entourage. I talked about the political element of it. He's also got a bunch of lawyers he's paying for on the regular. So he needs his money. This guy's burning through millions of dollars a year on lawyers. So it helps in that sense, for sure, the team building and the solidarity of the Trump supporters. But more importantly, like you said, does it help him sort of electorally? What is this doing to the primary? And as of right now, it bumped him up, I think, about 5 percentage points, whether it's head to head against DeSantis or whether it's against the 10, top people who might be joining the primary. Either way, it's moving him towards, he went up to 52% for a larger group and up to like 57% against head to head against DeSantis. So it's certainly helping him in the short term, but I think as other criminal charges play out, or like the federal case, for example, is a really big one, where he could, in theory, actually get really harmed by like a conspiracy charge to subvert the political process. For example, there's some big charges like the Georgia charge. Those are real charges that could really hurt. I think this one is a wash. It's both sides are getting what they want out of it.
Yeah, I don't know that this is going to really change the dynamics. It'll help them in the primary, but there are those swing voters, and there aren't all that many swing voters, as we've learned in recent elections, but there are some, and they don't want chaos. They turned against Hillary Clinton in 2016, not necessarily because they believed that there was fire where there was smoke with the Comey allegations, but that it just brought back memories of the chaos, the political chaos of it, and they don't want that. They want the country to be run, and so it'll benefit them in the short run, but possibly hurt them in the long run.
We're just here to do our business the way we've been asked to do it.
And it was done to prevent us from doing our job. And that is offensive to me.
There's a lot of little back and forth going on now with the state taking control, but rest assured, you ain't seen nothing yet. There's more to come in that regard.
A company has a right to freedom of speech just like individuals do. In effect, to seek to punish a company for its exercise of a constitutional right. And that just seems really wrong to me.
Next topic, we're going down to Florida. DeSantis is, of course, his campaign is not over yet. I don't even know if he's declared it yet. Honestly, I lost track of that, but it's not over. It's way too early to call it. People are sort of saying, "Oh, he's dead because his campaign is dead. He's gone down in the polls." He first he attacked Trump, then he's supporting him. He's made some real missteps in terms of foreign policy statements. He really is outside of his expertise on that. The book burning probably doesn't help him with a lot of moderates. So he has a little bit of trouble. His luster, whatever it is that he's pulling off in Florida, is not translating too much outside. And of course, he's outside of the state. And even in the state, I'm not even sure where he's at with the polls in terms of up against Trump. Trump has been first in the polls for the past month or two. And so he's got his problems. And he made a decision last year to take on Disney because in the culture war, Disney, of course, has a bunch of stuff that has been objectable to Christian fundamentalists and culturally conservative families. And so he decided he was going to teach him a lesson. And what a lot of people don't know is Disney World in Florida actually spans 3 counties. And because they didn't want to have everything done piecemeal in terms of permits for their building, the counties through the state created way back in the 60s, I believe, the Reedy Creek Community Services District, which has representatives of the different counties to basically handle the Disney World applications for growth and whatnot. Well, DeSantis wanted to punish Disney, so got the legislature to pass a law that basically strips the community service district of its power by handing it over to a commission, in which basically DeSantis handpicked the people who were going to be on it, and they were going to put ready to punish Disney. Well, Disney had been very quiet and very passive this whole time. I've been wondering why. It just seemed like they're not putting up a defense. Are they just going to take it or not? Well, in the very last community district meeting, the board basically did an end around of DeSantis and handed in a series of restrictive covenants and licensing agreements, handed Disney the power, pretty much carte blanche, to do what it wants in terms of development density and everything that really matters to Disney, which means that the power, it pretty much conveyed the power through these agreements, and they do have the legal right to do that apparently, so that the power that they're handing off to the commission really doesn't mean anything. They can do some oversight. They can subpoena records and things like that. They can harass them that way, but they can't really punish them the way DeSantis had intended to punish Disney. So DeSantis has issued an executive order calling for an investigation of the ties between the board members and Disney. Of course, they're all tied. Disney has always pretty much hand-selected the people it wanted on that thing. I mean, it's just, those counties depend on Disney World economically. And this is the way they set it up. This is Florida. Pro-business, right? I mean, the setup is completely what the Club for Growth types and chamber types love. So now he's being bitten in the butt by it, DeSantis is. And so he's calling for an investigation. The Disney's response is pretty much a yawn, and Bob Iger now is, if I'm saying his name right, he's the CEO of Disney, is now shooting back and calling DeSantis anti-business. And this is not the fight that DeSantis wanted to have. He gave up some capital to get this commission started, and now he looks like he's been completely outplayed, and I'm told that it's Iger, is Bob Iger. So a lot to discuss in there, but DeSantis may have really miscalculated, because one thing he's showing is he got outplayed by Disney's attorneys.
Yeah, and everybody knows Disney's got amazing attorneys. I just recall lots of different stories about how they comb the world looking for people infringing on their trademarks, and they take action against everybody. I actually know somebody who got a letter that had 40 lawyers across the top, and it just said cease and desist. They just walked into their store, handed them the letter, and you're going to get taken over the coals. So Disney's really got immense legal power.
Not to mention lobbying power to get the extensions on their copyrights to, be what is almost 100 years old now, where it's supposed to expire in 15 years. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but Disney is Florida's largest private employer and their largest corporate taxpayer. So they have a sweet spot in the state as it is. So when you square off against the governor, this is a high-powered legal battle here. What I think one of the most interesting developments of what happened, like you said, Disney's been pretty quiet, but you didn't mention what their legal maneuver, what it was actually, was that in the covenant they said that Disney's going to maintain the authority over all the things like fire protection, policing, road maintenance, development planning, everything that they really want for their resort, which is 4 theme parks, 2 water parks, and 18 hotels. I think that the connection was that the covenant lasts 21 years after the death of the youngest member of the royal family, who was alive at the day that they passed the resolution. So you're talking about 80. At least 80 years. For the rest
of the century, This is not an uncommon thing, by the way. In English common law, they use these things for indefinite covenants.
Gotcha. Well, that makes sense. I hadn't heard that piece of it, but I thought that was really interesting. And so that background is really just kind of sets the stage between the two of them. And for what it's worth, I think I've already started to see from the governor that the new board that has no power, they're already are in the process of retaining 4 different really heavy hitting law firms to try to overturn that. But I don't think that's going to go very far.
Including Laxalt, who just failed in his senator attempt in Nevada. He was expected to win. He lost to Cortez Masto, and he's like one of the lead attorneys on it. But they've got a bunch of attorneys hiring to see if they can crack through these covenants and invalidate the deal. But it doesn't look good for that.
Right. And then also he's using or arguably abusing the state power to call for a criminal investigation, saying that it was criminal for them to take this step, which that's a stretch. I think that's even more of a stretch, although, of course, I'm not an attorney, but certainly from what I've seen, it sounds like more of a stretch than maybe some kind of civil attempt to try to undermine that decision that was made. So but it does look like Disney got the upper hand. Plus, not only just did they outmaneuver DeSantis in the courtroom, but in fact, it makes DeSantis look bad. It does. Yeah.
Yeah, look, weak and ineffective on top of it, anti-business. Now he's going to be fighting the largest employer, largest private employer in the state, as you said. And, it's not good. He might lose some of the business people. I think this is why Asa Hutchinson has thrown his hat in the ring. He wants to become the primary anti-Trump. I don't know that he's going to get anywhere, but he definitely sensed blood because DeSantis. This is not the fight he wanted to have. He thought it would be over by now.
And there's this thread, like the thread on the sweater. Let's pull it for a minute. And so, well, what's the deal here? Why did DeSantis actually decide to put Disney in his crosshairs? And it was because Disney is an LGBT friendly organization that has a robust set of benefits to its employees, and their sort of corporate culture is one of openness and modernity and inclusion, and that's apparently anathema to DeSantis's whatever his character, his shtick, the role that he's playing in the culture war that he thinks will deliver him even more power because it was successful, I guess, in bringing him into Congress and into the governor's seat, but that is not something that really plays out amongst the majority of people. It just plays to the some lane of the Republican Party. Maybe that lane's too big for many people's tastes, but it's probably not a winning strategy, I would say, in the long term. But he had other popularity. He was very popular also because of COVID, his COVID response in Florida. So this lane that he's like picking this fight with Disney is him sort of misreading the room, I would argue. And you can't go down that road. People are modern, more so. I mean, obviously there's 20 states that would beg to differ, but overall, I think at least 51%, I would hope, of the states and people in our country at least see the future not in the same way as DeSantis. So that's one issue, the anti-business fight. For this particular reason, it seems like a culture war fight that doesn't translate well to the general.
No. Yeah, attacking Disney. The other thing that I really object, and again, maybe it's only progressives who object to this, but some of us are sanguine about the fact that DeSantis got handed a loss on the culture war, but this gives Disney a lot of power to override any local decisions. I mean, it's like, we complain about universities in our communities in California being able to like bring in all the students they want in and not provide housing or, anything for them. I mean, they just aren't bound by local laws by the way it's written. Well, this is really bad. Now, maybe Disney World won't misuse this. Maybe they'll be very careful as to how they apply it to do that. But if they muscle through projects over environmentalists and the rest, review, because they don't have Prop 65 or EIR system in Florida. It's not California, right? So it gives them a lot of power. Local counties now no longer have a say. I'm sure there's sort of an understanding that Disney is not going to take advantage of it to overreach, and probably if they're smart, they'll adhere to that. But the point is that there's nothing legally to stop Disney from really abusing that situation. Thank you, Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, and there's one more thing to point out. I think we do have a little bit more time here, so while we're kind of piling on Ron DeSantis, he's got a book out. I think it just came out about a month ago. It looks like, called "The Courage to Be Free: Florida's Blueprint for America's Revival." And so one of the latest things that I heard that I thought was pretty interesting was that there's been an objection, a formal objection in the state of Florida, that book ought not be allowed on the shelves in schools because of its content.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, because he's talking about some of these culture war topics.
Uh-huh.
And he's making, basically it falls afoul of all those traps that are put in place by his anti-LGBTQ rights agenda. And so they're saying, well, you talked about all these things, and there are people that are very upset by these things. So maybe these things shouldn't be in schools. And I think there was a formal response that said, well, there are no schools that have this book, so we're not concerned. Like they're saying you can't proactively ban a book, but I think that the political theater game, the one-upsmanship, the trolling that he excels in, somebody else was just happy, whoever it is that brought this up, their entity, their organization, whomever. If
the book shows up, it just takes one parent complaint, and it's got to be taken off until it's been reviewed, going through the review process.
Yeah, it's really, it's just one of those things. Again, I don't mean to make light of it, because people have strong opinions about this, but it seems like when you are engaged in the culture war in a way that is saying, like, we don't want our children to even have access to certain ideas, and it's so harmful to libraries as we know them and discourse as we know it, and just the normal day-to-day functioning process of schools and school districts. It's putting a heavy burden on some of these school districts down there. I look forward to learning a little bit more about it, but it just, as we've discussed in the past, for this 1 minute, I just think it's kind of ironic that he and his people have to defend his new book as not being afoul of the culture thought police.
Yeah, I mean, of course, around the country, people mischievous, as they're being called, pro-book parents are basically calling the Bible, saying the test. I mean, you've got this story about two teenage daughters who get their father drunk and bang him, right? I mean, that's right there in there, and it's actually kind of a disturbing story to me. But but let alone everybody says, well, should a second grader be exposed to that? Well, should a second grader be exposed to Old Testament stories? And so it's this is you play your hand, and of course people in Texas, the administrators are saying this is a misuse of the law. It's like, you don't get to decide what's a misuse. Parent raises the objection, you got to go through the process. Hopefully this is this does translate into it. I mean, like I said, I don't think DeSantis's campaign is over. There's still a lot of people that want him, and he's still very popular. I mean, he crushed Christ in the election last year. His whether you agree with or not, at least the reviews of his COVID policy, apparently worked out well. The economy has done well down there, so he's popular, but that doesn't necessarily translate to other states. Other states aren't living in there. If the economy's bad there, they'll blame everybody, not just somebody from one state or the other. And DeSantis has to really make his case. And so far, anytime he opens his mouth about foreign policy, whether it's about Ukraine or anything else, he's just showing himself to be unsophisticated. He wants to be the Trump that is that Trump with a brain, basically. He wants to be able to have that politics, but be able to give a wink and a nod to moderates to say, I'm not going to go that crazy. And he's just not striking the right balance.
And one last thing, I know we are down to like our last 30 seconds or so, but it also was a bad week for DeSantis in part. It was on Democracy Now! This week that some of the folks who were released from Guantanamo Bay have identified him as one of the lawyers, one of the Navy lawyers who oversaw their torture.
Oh my God.
And
I haven't seen that.
yeah, and so some of them were saying that he was like smiling and laughing, and when you get down to it, his response was, well, look, I had nothing to do with these decisions. I was just there representing the higher ups. But then there's evidence, there's a video of him saying that's the role he played in Guantanamo, was he was representing the legal decisions of the Navy. So that we might see some more of that if it hits mainstream press.
We sure will. We'll probably be discussing that later. I'm definitely going to catch up on it.
I've also been very clear that any decision that I render will be made based solely on the law and the Constitution. I have told everyone I am making no promises to you, but I can tell you that if my opponent is elected, I can tell you with 100% certainty that 1849 abortion ban will stay on the books.
This seems to be a pattern for you, Janet. Just telling lies about me. So you don't know what I'm thinking about that abortion ban. You have no idea.
Okay, last segment. Yesterday was probably the biggest election day of the year in terms of national significance. It had two very important races. Progressives have every reason to be happy. I'll start with the Wisconsin. There was the Chicago mayor's race and the Wisconsin race, which was between I'm going to try to pronounce it, Ms. Judy Protasewicz. I think that's how it is. Oh, I got it right there. Protasewicz. I'll never be able to type it out by memory. Hopefully Word Check will take it if she becomes a big deal. She defeated Dan Kelly, former State Superior Court Justice Daniel Kelly, who is very conservative, perhaps very right wing. People calling him Trumpy, and it was a really nasty campaign. We'll talk about some of the details of this campaign and why it's important, because this was also the most money spent on a judicial election in Wisconsin. They do hold elections for even their Supreme Court justices, which makes it a political issue. And so how do you run for judge? That's always the case. You can't, when you run for the legislature, you can say, if I am elected, I will introduce legislation, but you're not supposed to talk about how you'll rule on cases. And Protasewicz was a little sneaky there, actually, saying, well, if Kelly is elected, you can bet that that abortion law from 1849 will be upheld. It's a very controversial abortion law that's come back into play since the Supreme Court ruling, and it's a big deal. And so she's implying that she would vote against it, or at least be likely to. Stretching. You're not supposed to talk about how you're going to rule on cases that aren't before you. But Kelly was attacking her as being weak on crime, pulled out some stuff about how she beat her husband and other things. It got really nasty. I'm forgetting exactly what she said about him. I'll go into some of those details later, but it got nasty. In the end, however, she won. It wasn't even close. It was a landslide, over 10 points. I knew it pretty early on as I was looking at the returns, and already she was outperforming Biden in a bunch. Of course, Biden took the state by about 20,000 votes in 2020. She beat Kelly by 200,000. I think that Kelly just proved to be too extreme, and she was able to reveal them as that with a lot of hit ads that we'll go into. And I think it's important that we know some of the things that both of them did. I'm a little, like I said, I'm a little concerned that there were some aspects of her campaign that weren't fair, but it was definitely vicious.
So what I was going to say here is that you described accurately the sort of political confrontation between the candidates and the outcome. But I think that the issues are somewhat representative of other areas around the country. Something to think about. So, for example, you mentioned abortion. Justice-elect Janet Protasewicz, she was she was referencing obviously the Dobbs decision overturning Roe and basically making it crystal clear that, look, the Supreme Court has given it to the states. That means it's going to end up in the state Supreme Court. That means you need to know that the majority right now in our state Supreme Court is going to not allow abortion. So if you elect me, basically she was saying, you will then tip the balance of the court, and that would result in we could actually have we can really truly decide at the state level, like the people, you get the you can decide this. And I think that was a compelling case. And then once she broke through on that very popular issue, like you said, there's the gerrymandering issue, there's crime issue. So there's all sorts of things. Like Madison is very liberal, and Milwaukee to a lesser extent. So it's not, Wisconsin is not this like fringe sort of very far right leaning place like it appeared to be in the last election. Because, for example, some of Trump's scheme to overturn the election included electors from Wisconsin.
Right?
Yeah. So it, like, I think that she was successfully able to make this linkage that, like, look, this is a fork in the road here, and the people can decide to have an advocate for people power on the court. And I think that was the key, one of the keys, and also a takeaway that could, in theory, portend other things elsewhere in the country where these types of questions are being raised in the upcoming elections.
Yes, Republicans are flipping out over it. You go to their Twitter sites and they're saying it's hard to see how we get to 270 if we couldn't win this one. And this is when they were hoping for a big backlash because of the Trump indictment, but nobody in Wisconsin seemed to care about that. This is also a big deal because in Wisconsin, where Democrats routinely get about 50% of the vote, and this time if you say it's her, she's the Democrat, about 56% of the vote to 44. In the state where they routinely get 54%, another thing that happened was a special election is basically giving the Republicans a supermajority in this 50-50 state. They may try to impeach her. I think that'll backfire. I don't think that'll go very far, but because if they can override a veto on that, excuse me. But this is going to take into account that this could be a factor, this decision or this win for her, and now the progressives or the Democrats have a majority in the Supreme Court. I hate to put it that way, but that's the way it is. In Wisconsin, the gerrymandering could be taken up. There could be a lawsuit filed that takes the gerrymandering, and the Supreme Court may rewrite the districts for the next election, congressional as well as the state legislature. That's a huge deal.
Exactly.
You can bet Hodel, who's the one who barely won, and it shouldn't have even been that close against his Democratic opponent in a special election, has said that he's willing to consider impeachment and try to do it. But all that does is, even if they can impeach and convict for something, they get him out of office, and then the governor gets to promptly appoint another one who gets to ride out and be the judge until the next election season. So it's I think the Republicans have got a problem here. But yeah, what does this mean around the country? This was an off-year election. Democrats came out very motivated, probably also because abortion was on the ballot, sort of, by the way. I'm going to let you have the last word on Wisconsin, then we'll move over to Chicago.
Yeah, I think what you'd pointed out about the impeachment, that's obviously baked into the cake. The state senatorial candidate who won, the Republican, he was saying, yeah, I'll consider it. And he's going to receive immense pressure to do so. But when I kind of dug a little bit deeper, although there is a supermajority in the Senate, it's not the case in the House, in their lower house.
Okay.
So really, I think that was like a team building, posturing sort of thing. And I don't know enough about the minutia, but it appears that it wouldn't really get out of the legislature.
Yeah, or certainly not enough to override a veto.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's go to Chicago, where they were having an election for the mayor. A lot of the issues that we've seen discussed about crime in the cities. Chicago has, of course, a lot of violent crime in it and a lot of other problems. And you had a slew of candidates running, including the incumbent Lori Lightfoot, but she did not make it into the final two. So she was not a part of the election last night. We had Brandon Johnson, who is considered to be the more progressive of the two, Paul Vallas being the moderate, so to speak, maybe liberal on a national level, but certainly not the one who had said anything about defunding the police. Brandon Johnson did manage to get elected. He sort of backed off of that and kind of couched as to what he had meant, but he has won. This is after a couple of years of progressives not winning a lot of these elections and local races. This is a big win for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and for the third largest city in the country. And it's a big deal. Paul Vallas conceded. It was basically 51% to 49% vote. I think a difference of about 16,000 votes. Yeah, about that. Very close election. A lot of issues, being discussed about how to approach municipal policy. And obviously the police, there were a number of police who were threatening to resign and quit if Brandon Johnson won. We'll see if that actually happens. What do you got to say, Dave?
Yeah, so this wasn't anything I was following too closely. And then so when I went and checked it out the other day, I looked at some of the debates and forums that these candidates did. And it was pretty clear that the establishment candidate was Paul Vallas. He was the former Chicago Public Schools CEO. And he was in effect saying to Brandon Johnson, who was the progressive county commissioner, he was saying to him, like, you are looking to raise the cost of doing business, and you are looking to, you're going to be taxing a bunch, and you're going to be hamstringing the police, and you're going to be basically causing harm. That was the complaint from his side. And but what Brandon Johnson was saying is like, look, I have a plan. Like, you don't have a plan, and we've got some serious things we need to deal with. But all you're saying, you're not pinning down specific solutions. And so that argument may have been somewhat, obviously it was 51 to 49. But I think the finger on the scale here may have been that, Bernie Sanders came to town and kind of did some of the legwork and just said, look, these are real policy solutions, and look at where we've been under the leadership of the last few governors who have been a little bit too, a little bit too centrist, a little bit too right leaning. I say governors, I meant mayors. The last few mayors, and they just haven't really, put people first. So really what that was able to do was make a connection between, people of color and the sort of more traditional, when you think of liberal, you think of, basically Bernie Sanders liberal people, where the complaint against them was that they didn't do enough to reach across the, the full spectrum of potential progressive voters. And while it was only a very small marginal difference, I think that this is a template for a way to, maximize the power and influence of people who have a progressive policy agenda. And, obviously you and I both sort of endorse open-mindedness when it comes to creative policy solutions.
Yes.
And so, it shouldn't be discounted. Taking some of the responsibilities off the police shouldn't be discounted just because some people call it defund the police. Those people can call it. They choose to call it what they want to call it. But police people that we've looked at, police members that we've spoken with and that we've researched, they would be more than happy to have more resources targeted at eliminating some of the calls that they get. So, for example, investing in the community, mental health crisis intervention teams, all the things that the police don't necessarily need to be responding to. Those are the types of things that this person, Brandon Johnson, is claiming that he would put some money and energy behind.
No, it is a big deal because district attorneys have been recalled in San Francisco, for instance, for implementing progressive policies that maybe didn't work out so well. Except that there isn't a huge difference in the crime rates of cities that are being run more traditionally, but even by some Republican administrations. So it's but there's the visual. You get all of these those raids where people break into a jewelry store, you see them all on camera and they all leave it at once, the smashing of car windows all the time, and it has a psychological impact. Well, Chicago, has had a lot of shooting deaths over the years, but maybe they've also had some pretty hardline mayors that have tried these types of crackdowns, the stuff, and it doesn't really work for long. It doesn't matter how tough you are. You've got to treat criminality as a medical issue, as a social issue, and it's just not in vogue to say that right now because the rash of crime that's visible that we see all over the internet and on television is just it's had a psychological impact. But this Chicago decided, no, we're not going that way.
I did see a statistic. I think the people during the debate, one of the debates, people were referring to New York City, how who was elected in New York City, which is a former police officer, as the mayor, and so maybe they were saying that maybe that's the direction that Chicago would go.
Yeah.
But the fact check at the bottom was saying how in New York City there 30,000 violent arrests or incidents last year compared to 150,000 in about 20 years ago or so.
Right.
Maybe 25 years ago. So the crime rate increase is relative, and it's got to do, of course, with COVID lockdowns, mental health crisis, despair, economic inequities, and lack of opportunity. There's all sorts of things that could result in an uptick in crime. But overall, we're not talking about the old days where the whole country was really running ragged. This is more of a sort of a psychological aversion to the images of unchecked crime, like you said.
Absolutely. We'll probably be talking about this more in other cities because there are some other municipal elections of national significance coming up this year. But we need to take it to our very last segment.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beanie. The spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
All right, predictions. Dave, what do you got?
I got a pretty straightforward one this week. We talked about President Trump's indictment, 34 count by Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. But like I said in our segment, I didn't, it's not clear what the linkage between these other crimes that were spoken about. So I think that's a weak link. I think these other crimes that elevate these charges, these 34 charges from an open and shut misdemeanor case, like you said, of falsifying business records, to the felony case that's actually before us. So I think people are going to ask themselves, what are these crimes? And is this approach settled law, or is it really so novel that it actually is going to undermine the legal reasoning and justification? And what I predict is that when the dust settles, this will in fact be remembered as an overtly partisan political act and a distraction from the many number of significant offenses committed by Trump in his attempt to interfere with the electoral process.
Okay, I'm going to reference a story out of Texas, Llano County Public Library. There was an attempt to remove books. This was different from all of the other incidents because it's not a school library. There seems to be a lower threshold when it comes to schools, but there were about a dozen titles that had been removed from the shelves, and through a very secretive process, were basically going to be permanently removed from the shelves, including, I'm not sure why, mostly LGBTQ stuff, but In the Night Kitchen by Maurice Sendak, a children's book, I think something to do with witchcraft, being implied in it or something like that. Anyways, the court overruled, said that there was a 14th and First Amendment right to have these books, that different groups are being targeted by this banning, and the court ordered the library to return the physical books to the shelves. And I do think that there are going to be other attempts to bring this outside of the school across the country, but I am confident that the courts are going to shoot them down. The First Amendment is pretty strong, and there's only so far I think even the Supreme Court can go to really weaken that. It's one thing when you're talking about children and what gets into their curriculum, but I think once you got out of the school, the courts have said and will continue to say it stops there. Well, that's all we have for the week. A lot to talk about, and we'll have a lot more to talk about next week. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.